We're going to call the Woodland Park Planning Commission meeting of Thursday, February 13th, 2025 to order. We'll start out with a roll call.
Sure. Don DeZellem,
Present.
Ken Hartsfield,
Here.
Don Hoying.
Here.
Jared Newcomb,
Here.
Ken Kennedy.
Here.
Commissioner Lee Brown is absent this evening, and then Larry Larson.
Here.
Thank you. And then for the record, we also have in attendance this evening, Councilmember Catherine Nakai.
We will all stand. You can join me with the allegiance. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. The first order of business is approval of the January 23rd, 2025 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review that? Yes. Any comments, concerns? If not, do we have a motion for approval?
I move we approve the minutes as posted.
Second. You moved and seconded. All those in favor, say aye. Opposed?
I'm abstaining because I wasn't present.
That concludes our initial public hearing portion of the minutes. We're going to move right directly into the work session tonight. Continue discussion on the code review project review. I'm going to turn it over to Karen, and then she'll turn it over to Jen, and we'll go from there.
Yes. This evening, I want to start with things a little bit differently, because the question has come up with basically a question regarding authority. What gives us the authority to review regulations, make changes, revisions, those kind of things? So that authority actually is, it's initially spelled out in state statutes where it says municipalities can do certain things. And it's a whole list of things where we can potentially collect taxes. We have the ability to subdivide or regulate subdivision of property, the zoning of lands, police powers get delegated to a local police department. All that kind of stuff is spelled out in state statute. So that's what provides like the boundaries or the global parameters for what we as a municipality can do. Because we're a home rule municipality, we also have a charter that further details some things. And in a lot of ways that charter mirrors statute, but there's little things that are off here and there. But then there's also within our own code, the provision, it's in section 18.69 that spells out, excuse me, I'm trying to pull it up. And it's literally titled amendments within the zoning section of the code, 18.69. And within that section, it says the city council may, after a public hearing, of which at least 15 days prior notice has been given in an official newspaper, and after posting to signs as required in section 18.72.060, amend, supplement, change, modify, or repeal the boundaries or regulations of this title or those subsequently established after submitting them to the Planning Commission for its recommendation and report. Planning Commission shall be allowed up to 30 days to review the proposed amendment, supplement, change, modification, or repeal. And if it fails to submit a report to the City Council after that time, it shall be determined to have recommended approval of the proposed amendment, supplement, change, modification, or repeal. So all of our ordinances and regulations go through a public hearing process. And what we're doing right now is we're looking at specifically zoning and subdivision regulations that have already gone through all of those different public processes. So there was initially a proposed set of regulations. They were vetted through Planning Commission and went through public hearing. And then that recommendation went to City Council, who then ultimately adopted those ordinances. Those ordinances all get codified or integrated into one central location. And that is the responsibility of the city clerk to track all of that stuff. That's actually spelled out in our charter, where it clearly addresses that and puts that in the hands of the city clerk. And so on our website, sorry, I got too many windows open here. I'm going to try and share here. On our city website, there's a section related to codes or our city charter and ordinances. And within that, within that, if you go in and look at a section of the city ordinances, at the end of these different sections, you can see a reference to the actual ordinance that established the specific language. So here under planned unit development, under the purpose statement, here at the very end of this, section B, it says ordinance 7-1971, section 2, a part of that. And then it was actually the prior ordinance was ordinance 46-1969, section 207.1. So these regulations related to planned unit development, as authorized by state statute, were established back in the 60s, even the 70s. And as you scroll down through these sections, and I apologize, I'm like missing things on my screen here tonight, like a scroll bar. And I don't have a touch screen.
You can see it.
I can't see it.
Look up on the TV, maybe it's cut off in your screen.
It is cut off on my screen and I can't make my mouse move.
A little bar there.
Yeah, I'm trying to get there. My little trackpad is not cooperating. There is a delay between what I can see on my screen versus what's going on there. Let's try this. Okay, sorry.
There you go.
I'm getting there. CJ would have no problem with this. I, on the other hand, am failing tonight.
Like playing.
I'm good now, I think. So like in this next section of PUD regulations, it goes back to the original ordinance from 69. It references changes from 71. And then there were also changes that were done in 88. So all of these sections are these references are talking about the actual ordinance document that went through Planning Commission, City Council for approval. And then the language from those gets pulled out and integrated into the central location for ease of use. So that's where this all comes into play and gets coordinated. So when somebody's looking for an ordinance related to something, a lot of times the regulations you need is right here already readily available on the city website. There's a lot of times on these older ordinances, there's not a lot in the whereas statements or the basis for why something was looked at. And then not all of those ordinances are available in a digital format, but they are up in the city clerk's office. So if there's something you're really wanting to see, you're potentially looking for a paper copy, depending upon how far back it is. So the other thing I wanted to talk about specific to, actually, I'm going to get to that in a minute. So, so that's where how this happens. And so what we're doing with this project is we're looking back through subdivision and the zoning regulations primarily in terms of trying to restructure things That's the biggest part of what we're doing is not diving into the content typically. The exception to that is really been this chapter, this new proposed chapter 6, which is the administration chapter, where we spell out the processes. You've heard me say before that we did a plow through all of our regulations and identified, I think, I'm gonna get it wrong tonight, but it was like 26 different locations in the zoning regulations, like 23 different places in the subdivision regulations where process was embedded in things. So we're trying to pull all that out into one centralized location. So it's a lot easier for an applicant to understand what is the process I have to go through to have my application reviewed and considered. And so we're really plussing that out, centralizing it. And then this is where we are having to clean some things up because it is considerably less than clear on several occasions in terms of what's going on. So specifically tonight, we're looking at the PUD section. And we definitely struggled with this between Jen and I, between the consultant and the staff, in terms of what do we need to be doing with this? And there's things here that we can't answer. And Sally, I can see you online watching us tonight. God bless you, girl. And I'm sure you could fill in the blanks for us, but you've retired and we respect that. But like one of the things that's not obvious to like the new person coming in is that there's not a real discernible difference between a preliminary development plan and the final development plan for a PUD. It's just really not clear. And then the other piece is, when is that PUD zone effective? That's typically part of that rezoning process and that adoption of the ordinance that dedicates or designates a piece of land as PUD. But does that happen concurrently with the preliminary or the final PUD development plan? That's the piece that I'm not able to put together in terms of when that stuff comes together. So again, within this administration chapter, we're looking to document our current procedures, which you've already seen that in some of our sessions prior under those common review procedures. That's typical for anything that we do, any application that comes through. Trying to streamline things whenever possible. And what you're going to see tonight is one of our attempts to do that. And then in putting things together tonight, we actually took advantage of Larry Larson's expertise in prior career as a planner and used him to kind of test our thoughts and in terms of what we were putting together. So it wasn't just some crazy thought by a staff person. We roped one of you guys in and had him just kind of make sure we weren't too far off of what he thought would work for this community. So that's the draft we have in front of you. Now, the other thing I want to do is just touch base briefly on PUDs and step back into Colorado statute a little bit. And there's this lovely book out there called Colorado Land Planning and Development Law. And it's a group of attorneys throughout the state that have dove into all of those statutes associated with planning, zoning, development, and put together kind of like the short version for planners in more lay language. So from that, there's a chapter in there related to PUDs. Local zoning regulations generally dictate permissible uses, densities, and floor areas, setback requirements, roadway and open space requirements on a district by district basis. And you saw that many months ago when we were looking at our existing zone districts, whether it's suburban residential, multifamily, urban, all the basic parameters behind all of those. So in practice, however, they sometimes do not allow, one, certain combinations of residential, commercial, public, and recreational uses, or two, the dimensional flexibility needed for innovative designs. So to provide additional flexibility in the use of zoning and subdivision powers, the Colorado General Assembly in 1972 adopted the Planned Unit Development Act. The powers granted to local governments in that act also provide an opportunity to integrate design of the buildings and uses approved for a site, traditionally a zoning item, with the design of the site and individual lots that are often governed by subdivision regulations. So this other section here, I think, is very helpful in illustrating that. And it says, perhaps the most important aspect of the PUD Act is that it enables municipalities and counties wide discretion to negotiate almost every aspect of the proposed development in return for a PUD approval. In theory, the planned unit development process protects the public interests by trading off more flexible local government regulations for a higher level of forethought, design concern, or community amenities from that landowner. And the development, and part of what they can put together with that is they're referring to it as a development guide, or in our case, we were calling it a general development plan, and what you had in your document. That guide often lists specific controls such as uses, densities, setbacks, and dedications for the PUD project, as well as the means for control and enforcement of those provisions. Because PUDs allow that greater flexibility than traditional zoning, PUD procedures often emphasize detailed site planning more than in traditional zoning districts. So that's some of that background in state law that gets us to this evening and our look at PUD regulations and trying to balance how can we streamline this, provide additional clarity. So both the developer and staff is, it's a lot easier for us to understand what is the direction, what needs to happen, what are the approval criteria related to the rezoning, as well as criteria for that general development plan. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jen here this evening. So thank you. Oh, and actually real quick, any questions about some of that background, since I just prattled on?
Could you tell everybody who may not be as familiar what some of the PUDs that we have in
Okay.
Woodland Park are currently?
Stone Ridge is definitely one of our largest PUDs. Walmart was a PUD.
Yes.
You guys know better than I do. Karis, the Sturman property across the street was also a PUD. There's something else on the south side, Thunder Ridge, I think,
There's the Pines at Tamarack is also a PUD.
I think that's, yeah, that one is. I'd say I'm lost without my zoning map. That I can see where the PUD designations are, that would help me kind of come up with that. But we do have a number of PUDs here in the community. So. Other questions?
Not directly a comment for staff or a question, but I think the word flexibility is so key for a PUD. PUD allows the developer to set the rules. And then the city says, that's acceptable. We can live with that. I want a 45-foot height requirement. I want a 25-foot or 20-foot setback. That's where it comes from. It comes from the applicant himself to make the proposal to the city. These are the rules that I want to follow by for a PUD. So it gives them quite a bit of discretion, flexibility to do that. And with that is that all we're going to see is hopefully innovative design. We're going to see a speed up the process, and it's a good tool to also mix various uses. Normally, residential is segregated from commercial, so on and so forth. A PUD can kind of put all those together. So there's a lot of good advantages of having a good sound PUD regulation in our code. And the question I have is for Don. We saw your email. Did Karen answer your email? I mean, your questions.
Yeah, and maybe we're kind of taking my intent a little deeper than I was really meant. What I want to know is when we read through the existing code and we revise it or propose to revise it, the history of where certain parts came from, particularly things that are like we list approval or which of course can also be disapproval criteria, which really reflect what our responsibilities are and what our authorities are. So I want to understand where those originated from or how they've been amended over time, and as much as possible, stay true to them unless we find there's a reason to recommend to the planning commission for those to change. So I just, you know, as we go through, we make recommendations to the change of the text. If we're helping with clarity, helping with the streamlining of the process, all for it. If we're inadvertently changing the original intent, then I'm cautious. And I feel that's something we should, not that we can't recommend that change, but, you know, in general, I feel we should remain true to the intent. Specifically, if there was exact wording in an ordinance, we should deviate from that only very carefully and on exception. So all that said, how can we do that if we don't actually have the source documents?
Mhm.
And so I found that frustrating that we're going through and reviewing and making recommendations for changes for these, for the code. When, you know, we may be unfortunately ignorant of what came before and what specific elements were in there. And then, because some of the things are, you know, we're just, when we set out to, like Congress sets out to make a law, it doesn't list every individual tiny procedure. But it's very clear about what's to be achieved, who, and more importantly, who is the authority and what are the bounds of that authority. Those things, in that instance I gave, you know, if they're part of law, they can't be touched. Then the agency who is responsible for that area of the government will make rules and policies to implement that, but they can't change the law. Now, we're in a situation here where, you know, as far as this goes, the city council is the law, so we can recommend a change to it. So we have more flexibility than the example I gave, but all told, you know, I feel we want to remain true to the original intent, and if provided specific language. And I just felt a little unsure about where we should be free to change things and where we should be more cautious, lacking those reference documents.
Throughout these different sections that we've been going through in the process, this chapter 6, statements. So whenever possible, that language has been coming out of the existing ordinances. A lot of times it's buried in other locations. It's not labeled as purpose, but when you read it, it's like, okay, this is spelling out the purpose. There are instances where Jen and I have been writing purpose statements or pulling them out of the model code for the state. Because that model code is again based on statute and very common things that you can do around zoning and subdivision. And then looking at it through that lens of our comprehensive plan, this particular community. And then that's where we rely on you guys too, to represent the community in terms of, okay, this applies, that doesn't. So that's where that purpose, that intent of the section or a set of regulations, you're seeing that get better clarified here. And this is where all this has landed, is in the current regs, and that's what we are working off of. And then there's an example actually at the very end of our document this evening, under review criteria for PUD zones. There's a criteria that currently reads that the design of the PUD illustrates a unique urban design concept that properly relates to adjoining properties. I've been here 3 years. I have never had anybody in my office going, by God, we need to be more urban. Not one soul has said that in my office. So you saw in that particular part, we had struck through the word urban and then made a note to strike urban, as we didn't see that as applicable to with the part character. You guys can all say, oh, Karen, no, we do aspire to that, put that back, which is why we're having the conversation with you all. But anyhow, that's just an example. There are instances where we have added criteria, but things that are really common or seem applicable, we've reworded some of the current criteria sometimes just because it's awkwardly written. This particular section is, I guess, less clear because we were doing such a wholesale restructuring. It really wasn't possible to come through and do a strikeout and show you what we saved. So I apologize that this section's probably a little frustrating from that perspective. But at least at our level, we think it accomplishes what this community needs it to accomplish. You guys can come back and tell us, oh, no, this is all wrong, rewrite this, go back to preliminary and final plans, and that's fine. We will happily do that. But we're probably gonna need some help in discerning the difference between a preliminary and a final plan. So I may be calling you, Sally. But anyhow, for tonight, this is where we are. So, I don't know, Jen, if you, or I guess we were still kind of in questions on what I had talked about. Anything else, or does that help? Hopefully I didn't confuse things. All right, Jen, I think we're good.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm going to share my screen and show, we can kind of talk through your comments on this chapter, but I also wanted to tie into what Karen was saying, talk a little bit about why we have restructured this chapter the way that we have. So as Karen said, the preliminary and final kind of structure of your current PUD section is fairly unclear, and the process is fairly unclear as well. And so we did quite a bit of brainstorming to figure out what might be a better process for this. And then, like Karen said, building off of other communities, the model code, just kind of what best practices for PUDs. So what we came up with is kind of basically a 3-step process. So you'll see that in this procedure, where we have an optional concept review. So when someone comes in with a PUD, as you guys have probably, those of you who have been on planning commission for a little while have seen, when a planned unit development application comes in, it's not as straightforward as a subdivision or a site plan. There's a lot of times quite a bit of nuance. Like Larry was saying, maybe there's some flexibility in design being requested. Maybe it's mixing uses. Maybe it's trying to mix some residential and commercial uses on a property that is only zoned for one or the other. So oftentimes it's kind of like throwing darts at the wall a little bit, to see if the concept of the developer is approaching would be acceptable to the community, to the planning commission, to city council. So with that in mind, we thought, maybe there should be, in addition to a pre-application meeting, which is fairly, the pre-application meeting really is intended to give staff the opportunity to work with the applicant on what is specifically required of the submittal process. Not so much looking at kind of a conceptual design. So we thought, let's roll in a conceptual review. So a conceptual plan review where the applicant can bring in, here's my general concept. Here's what I'm trying to do. Does this generally meet the comprehensive plan policies and goals and the requirements of the code? Is this kind of headed in the right direction? And then they can move into just to kind of have that conversation. And then move into a general development plan. And as Karen was saying, right now your code has a preliminary development plan and a final development plan. What we've kind of done is, instead of doing a preliminary development plan, you do a very, rough conceptual plan to get the idea kind of out there, and then move into just a development plan rather than having a preliminary and final. So it would just be one general development plan. And if you can picture, actually, Karen, would it be helpful if I pulled up that one that I've shown you before? I wonder if that would help.
I think so. It's multiple,
Okay.
which is kind of fun.
Wasn't-
Nothing else.
Yeah. Let me search for that here for a sec. But basically a general development plan is kind of showing the overall use of the site. And it would go along with a rezone, because when you're doing a PUD in Woodland Park, you're rezoning that property. Some communities do an overlay. You guys are doing a rezone, which I think is actually a very solid way to do PUDs. So I'm trying to multitask here, and apparently it doesn't
doing that,
work very
Jen.
well.
I want to add, the conceptual, the optional concept review, as much as that's set up to definitely have the developer bring in some documents that try to illustrate or introduce what it is we're doing. There is the ability in that step as it's written where staff can say, well, these are things I'm uncertain about this. Let's go ahead and take the planning commission's pulse as well at this particular stage. So there's the option to even do that. Some guys may decide that we're not going to do this. It might be small enough. It's straightforward enough. I'm not doing that. There is, I think the ability for staff to push back. And then when we get something, decide, okay, wait a minute, maybe we should have the planning commission provide some additional thoughts and guidance. So that's written into there as well. So Jen, back to this.
Yeah.
Plan.
Thank you, Karen. So this PUD development plan is for a development over in Elbert County. It's rather large, so I don't think, you're not looking at PUDs on this scale particularly at the moment, but just to give an idea, this is kind of the level of what we would be expecting at a development plan. Where you're showing, access, kind of the road that might go through the site, where those points of access into kind of bubble plan, areas, saying generally this area is going to be single family. So like the lighter yellow at the top is a lower density residential. The more bold yellow in the middle is kind of standard lots, single family residential, and then when you get to the bottom of the page, it gets higher density, and then the red is commercial development. So this is looking at kind of a large neighborhood development. And then you see kind of trails and open space. So just how someone is intending to lay out the site. This is probably the level that you would see with a development plan that would go along with your rezone application. So then you would be approving, yes, you're going to rezone to PUD. This is generally the layout you're going to accommodate. And then from there, from that approval, they would move into either a preliminary plat if it was a large site like this, or sometimes for say like your Walmart site, they probably would have moved straight into a site plan and then detail out that site plan in concurrence with this development plan. So
And just for scale, Jen, this is what,
Yeah.
probably 80 to 100 acres.
yes, exactly. So much larger scale. They're building an entire community, it seems, out there, but hopefully that gives you a little context for kind of what the development plan is looking for. Any questions about kind of that general process that we've developed here? It's just kind of conflating the preliminary and final plat or preliminary and final development plan into one really solid development plan that would come through with the rezone, and then, moving into your additional procedures for entitlements.
Any questions? Thoughts?
So you're basically taking what the preliminary plan and the final plat and combining it into one,
The preliminary and the final plan,
or final plan, sorry.
yeah, into
Into
one
one
general
general
development
development.
plan.
Okay. And at what point does that, so after that gets approved or rezoned or whatever, is that what gets registered with the state? Or does that come later? Because don't PUDs get registered with the state at some point, because they have to come back to us to change it, right?
To my knowledge, they do not get registered with the state. There's the ordinance that established the PUD district for a specific area of land.
Okay.
And then I see the general development plan getting approved concurrently with that ordinance. So afterwards, at another point, if they're needing to subdivide further, you're seeing subsequent applications for the subdivision. If for some reason it's already a platted lot, you'd be seeing, well, if it's set up as a permitted use, it would be handled at staff level for, the site plan review and approvals. Or if the use has been set up as a conditional use within that zone, that would then go through the conditional use hearing process, where one of the things you're looking at there, is it consistent with the parameters of that general development plan for the PUD?
Okay. There was some I've got some different information in the past, so we can talk about it offline.
Okay. Yeah, I've not ever dealt with that, so that's all that means.
Yeah, and Councilmember Nakai, in some communities, what they have done is, if you're staying generally, concurrent with that the general development plan in your preliminary plats and moving forward, then there's no need to come back. But say you get a general development plan approved and you don't come back with any subsequent applications for 3 or 4 years, and then they want to change it significantly, then they would need to come back through and get a new general development plan approved. Prior to, I would think that's what other communities I've seen have done. But a lot of times there's like a flexibility clause that says if you're only changing some of these bubbles by 10% or something, then it's not a need to come back through.
And then Jen and I did talk on last Friday, the need to actually write some of these additional sections. One would be specifically addressing plan changes. Because you notice that's not in there at the moment. So we recognize that that's a strong possibility. And then maybe some of them, the minor changes, if you're within 10% of these parameters, it can be administrative. If it's more than that, it needs to go back through the public hearing process. But actually having that language spelled out, we recognize that is missing at the moment. And then we also talked about the need for a transitional clause or some way to acknowledge the existing PUDs, how those documents are viewed in light of these potential changes. So we recognize that needs to be drafted yet also. Okay, Jen.
All right. I'm going to walk through our comments from Conveo. And to be honest, it was a fairly short list this time. And not a lot that feel like they need a ton of discussion, but I'll just run through them anyway. And as usual, our Conveo pops our bubbles based on when you put your comment in rather than where it's logical on the page. So comment number 1 was to add a new subsection 2 to read, refer to UDC section 2.05.03 planned unit development zone district for additional purpose and intent, provision, standards, and requirements. I think that would be fine to add into this document, because as Karen was saying earlier, we have the standards and some of the other pieces of PUDs that are in a different chapter, which would apply to this process as well. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but I thought that was a good comment to add. All right. This next one I did want to discuss a little bit. It was in section, let's see, here in the procedure, 2A, which talks about the optional concept review plan or plan review that we just talked about. Larry had proposed a little bit different language saying during the pre-application conference, a staff PUD concept review with an accompanying PUD concept plan is required prior to the submittal of a PUD application. And I just wanted to maybe discuss this one a little bit further and actually maybe Karen, get your feedback on this. I know we had talked about the pre-application being kind of a separate process, but I didn't know if we wanted to bring the concept review into the pre-app or if the pre-app is separate from the concept review, in which case I think we should maybe clarify that further.
I do want to clarify terminology. That pre-application conference is literally the meeting between the developer and the people, the staff people, in terms of this is the application form. These are the things we want to see. These are things to be advised of when you're putting together your application. Specific documents that they're bringing back. The reason we called this a concept review is I was trying to distinguish it from the sketch plan that happens with subdivision. So that was that distinction. So we're trying to draw pretty firm boundaries around that pre-application meeting which is, like I said, literally what's going on with staff to help the developer get a successful application through the door. And then these different stages of review. So I guess the question would be the concept review, that idea, we set it up or suggested it as optional, but we could certainly make it a required step. So that may be more the discussion point.
Let me tell you why I recommended that it be mandatory. And that is, at the pre-application level, you really kind of get an introduction to the project itself. And that would may change as you get into a concept plan review. But it's just basically to talk to the applicant, say, this is what you want to do, this is a procedure you could do, this is the PUD process you can follow, and this is what you need to do that. So I wanted to make a distinction between the early pre-application meeting and a concept review.
Okay. See, in that pre-application, I believe that's actually set up in other places. Like under that, that table that we need to go back and fill in some more, whereas whether or not a pre-application meeting is required, you would see a checkbox there. I think that's where that largely lives.
And it appeared just by reading what was proposed, that section was not addressed. That's why I wanted to address it.
Okay. So long as we address that consistently in that section of the code, I think we'll be okay. So the next question is, should the concept review be a requirement or an optional step? I think that's a significant decision point.
And yet I believe it's very important that it be mandatory.
Tend to agree with you, Larry. Yeah, otherwise you get down. You get a developer too far down a rabbit hole. I agree with Larry's, I think making it a mandatory situation.
Okay.
So it's out and open and you can, yeah, I just think it should be discussed with staff.
Okay, everybody else pretty comfortable with making it a required step?
I mildly disagree. I mean, if they feel that confident or they are in a hurry and want to take the risk of proposing something that might get shot down, you know, it's kind of on them. Don't need to mandate common sense. But like I said, mildly
It's not
disagree.
that common, so.
I would not, you know, be hard over one way or the other.
Don, Giselle, you were not nodding your head a different.
No, I agree that it should be a mandatory thing.
Okay.
I mean, how often does somebody come in with PUD plan and it's just like some Joe Schmo off the street? Is it, they're typically knowing what they're doing up front, I would think.
We've not had a high demand for that particular application type. Right after, or right as I was starting, there were some folks that were amending an existing PUD.
Hmm.
And then since then, we've had an amendment to another one. And then otherwise, it's just extensions of PUD, preliminary PUD plans that keep getting extended.
I'd say it's probably a good thing to have it be mandatory, especially if you don't have like people coming and beating down your door to, you know, review these initial PUDs.
Okay, we can certainly do that. Ken Kennedy?
Yeah, I don't have an issue with making it mandatory or not. I do kind of question whether we want to be inserting these changes when we're trying to do the restructure. We've talked about that back and forth, but you know, it is adding work for the applicant potentially when they may not have a significantly abnormal concept that would be difficult for them to know what to do from other information in the document. But it's pretty simple if they just come in and say, here's what our plan is, and they show you their initial document and review it with you and get comments. And then that may be, because they're going to develop a plan to bring to the general plan review anyway, so. I'm okay either way, because it's just prior meeting with staff instead of bringing it straight here, I guess.
And certainly by requiring the
Does it put a burden on staff to add that? I mean, like you said, we don't have that many PUD applications per year.
No, because the goal is really to help the applicant have a successful application.
Yes.
So the earlier you can start that dialogue, I think the better it is for the applicant. Sometimes folks get attached to their vision and they get way far down a road, and then they come in and talk to the planning staff.
That's
and
when they bump up.
then they're all
against them.
mad at us that, it's like, well, what do you mean I have to do that? That doesn't work at all. You're killing my project. And it's like, no, we're not. We're trying to help you be successful.
And the other reason I propose that too is that it's consistent with the other processes we've been talking about up to this point. It starts with that pre-application meeting.
And I appreciate your concern about, are we adding more work? I don't know that we are. I think we're just changing when the work happens. Because like I said, right now we have a preliminary plan and a final plan, and it's just not clear when those things happen relative to that zone designation change. So in this case, we're coming up with this concept review, essentially a sketch plan for their PUD, and then the actual plan document that is what documents all of the parameters associated with that PUD zone. All right, Jen, so what I heard is the concept review, it becomes a required step. The question I have next is, are you comfortable with that being primarily at a staff level with the option to refer it up to Planning Commission? I think that's how the sketch plan is worded, but I'd have to go back and look. Larry's nodding yes.
I'd say yes.
Yeah.
John,
Yeah.
Ken.
On a preliminary basis, yeah.
Okay, the heads are nodding yes, Jen.
Okay, great.
Because I sometimes you guys are this big on the screen in terms of what she's looking at. So I'm just trying to make sure that she's.
We need to get big.
It'd be more exaggerated. Thumbs.
Big phone.
You guys are the size of a pinhead and my head is gigantic on your screen. Okay, perfect. Great conversation. Thank you. Larry, you had identified that we, in some cases, say purpose and in others say purpose and intent. We have talked about this in the past. I think we've switched to purpose in some of the later documents. Either way, we'll go back and make it consistent throughout the entire document. I don't want to reopen a can of worms, but I think we did all agree on just saying purpose rather than purpose and intent, but I can look back into some old notes, and if you have a specific thought either way or recollection, open to suggestions.
You hit it exactly. We just need to be consistent between all application types.
Perfect. Let's see. I did catch, we were trying to say PUD, general development plan, and then I think we dropped the PUD in a couple places, and that's what some of these comments are. So we'll make sure that's consistent as well. Same with concept plan review. Looks like here, Larry, you were suggesting PUD concept plan review, and I think that's fine to clarify that. Number 5. Larry, I think you've had this comment before, and we've all kind of said, let's stick a pin in that for now, which is to move the 1 up to, so like where it says B eligibility, and then we have only 1 item rather than a full list. You're suggesting to move that up to the eligibility line. And I know we had talked before about leaving each of these, purpose, eligibility, procedure, all on their own line, kind of as a header. But we also were trying to talk to the codifiers to just see what works the best on when it fully gets codified in Municode. So yeah, just wanted to recognize that comment.
Okay.
6 is, again, just adding PUD in front of that general development plan. And 7, I think we already kind of addressed that, the purpose and intent statements. That's just a general comment that was made. 8 is right here under procedure 2B, the PUD general development plan, kind of how that process works. And Ken, you had a good catch there. I think this is supposed to reference 6.03 E rather than D. I think we probably had added something at one point and didn't quite go back and update that one reference. So thank you for that catch. Another one, I believe this is, yes, in the purpose statement, Don DeZellem, you mentioned, and I do agree, we use the term, this section is to spell out the process, and you said to define or some other word rather than spell out, so.
Yeah, to me, spelled out, just. It's kind of like when you're talking down to somebody. Let me
Right.
spell it out to you.
Right. Yeah, maybe it's describes the process or something,
Specify, define.
specify, yep, like it. I'm gonna
And Jen,
just jot a couple.
we probably already have similar language in one of our other sections that we can
Yes,
double check for consistency also.
agreed. We will definitely change that wording. Oops, I put that on the wrong line.
What you have, Larry?
I was just gonna say, when we're talking about a specific comment, please let us know where it is in the draft.
Yes, we'll do. That one's just right here at the top in the purpose statement.
Okay.
Okay.
Comment 10 is down here under concept plan review D1. And again, it was just adding the purpose of a concept review. So just adding that terminology PUD in front. So adding PUD concept plan. And that's the same down on 11, which is at the bottom of the page here, just adding PUD in front of concept plan. And then 12, I believe. Nope, that's the same comment, Larry, that you made before about purpose and intent or purpose. So again, we'll be consistent in the final
Yes.
drafting. You wanted to really hone that one in, eh?
I didn't want to miss any.
Yeah, good. Thought we were moving on to the next page, but I could be. Nope, we still have one more on this page. Say again?
Oh, go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Item 13, is under C1, C procedure 1, the PUD submission shall adhere to the common review procedures in section 6.02. We shortened that up based on previous conversation, but Larry, you have a great suggestion, and honestly, I think this might have been the direction we had all intended it to head. Maybe we shortened it up too much. You had suggested adding regarding required pre-application conference, application submittal and processing and public hearing notice and requirements. So if everyone's okay with adding that language saying this is what 6.02 is directing us to, I think that's a good suggestion. But did want to kind of just throw that back out. And if you want me to reread that, it's we're referencing those common review procedures. And instead of just referencing the section, kind of having a bit of language that says what's in that section. Does
I'm
that work for
inclined to-
everybody?
Jen, I'm inclined to stick with just the title of this section.
Just the title? Okay.
Because what if you skip a part? Then you're like
Mhm.
starting to second guess things. It's like, well, you left this one out of the list, and I'm good with being succinct.
You have to keep track of it in two places again, which we were trying to minimize in some cases, but it's not very user friendly necessarily just seeing the number either.
Well, that's why I gave the title, common review
Yeah.
procedures. I mean,
It's just up the page basically, right? 6.02 instead of 6.
Earlier in the,
Yeah.
chapter, yeah.
So it's not that hard to find.
My thought is let's try it with the shortened version consistently throughout. And once, we've got the the draft 2, it may make more sense at that point, because we recognize that's part of what everybody's starting to really get a little frustrated with. But I swear we're close to the end of this chapter where we're gonna be able to have everything pulled back together in a second draft. So just thanks for hanging in there with us.
Okay, good. Thanks for that discussion. Now we're on to the next page under, so as you can see, we've gone through the process and now we've described the concept review plan, purpose, procedure, and submittal requirements. And then we get into the PUD general development plan, purpose, procedure, and submittal requirements. And there's a comment that under purpose, maybe we change to purpose and intent. And I think per our previous conversation, whether we do purpose and intent or purpose will be consistent throughout.
And my memory is that we settled on just purpose, quite honestly, for whatever that's worth.
I couldn't remember.
All right. That's my recollection as well, but we may have
double
changed our
check.
minds somewhere along the last couple of years. Number 15 is up here at the top under submittal requirements for the concept plan review, and just adding PUD in front of concept plan for consistency. Same with down in the PUD general development plan, adding PUD in front of that. So again, just being consistent. And this one, Larry, good catch, number 17. At one point, we were calling it a general PUD development plan, and we've switched it and did not catch that one. So we'll get that fixed. Let's move on to 19. See, where are you? 19. Under the concept review plan, submittal requirements. For consistency, we've been adding application and filing fee to all of these. But in hindsight, you're correct. I don't know that there would be, well, I guess that would be a question, Karen. Would there be an application and filing fee for a concept plan review?
Quite possibly. That's ultimately something that we potentially bring to city council in terms of establishing a fee for that. Yeah, at this point, at this point, there is not one, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be.
Okay, so we'll want to keep that in.
Yeah, because right now there's no application fee for a sketch plan associated with a subdivision. So that's as a weird aside.
Okay. Perfect. And then the next question was under, it's right up here under procedure for the concept, PUD concept plan. And the question is this proposed to be a formal submittal? So I think that goes right back to what we were just saying. And I'm interpreting this as yes, that would be a formal submittal rather than a part of the pre-application review.
Correct.
Yep. Okay. And actually, Karen, that's one thing that we may want to spell out in here is which comes first. I think what you and I had talked about is concept plan review comes first, and then it's pre-application submittal for the full rezone application. But maybe it needs to be switched. I'm kind of muddled in my
Chances
head
are-
on that.
From my perspective, prior to anyone submitting an application, it's always advisable to sit down for that pre-application meeting. That's where there's no charge, is you get to, pick staff's brain about what it is you're wanting to do on your project. There's no charge to shop your idea about what I want to do, and then how do I get into the process to make applications. So prior to any application, it's advisable to have that meeting so that you have suggestions and guidance in terms of how to navigate potential stumbling blocks, or literally how to have a more successful application, how to make the process go smoother. So that's where I see the pre-application happening is, like I said, it's free of charge, and prior to submitting anything, we're just actually calling it out as sit down with staff. It's in your best interest to do so.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Karen. Let's see. That takes us to the next page here. 21 is a suggestion to add under the supplementary materials for a PUD general development plan to add an item that is the feasibility of the project for the availability and supply of adequate city water resources and services. So basically, you know, some documentation that there's adequate water supply. Any questions or comments on that one? Okay. Similarly, item 24 is, let's see, in this list of items to be submitted with the PUD general development plan, down here, number 22 is a statement as to whether or not a homeowners association is intended. The suggestion is to just move that statement down to supplementary materials. I know we were kind of intentional about putting it where we did, but I think it could go in either location.
I think it was a situation, Jen, of it, that's where it currently lives.
Mm-hmm. Maybe.
Submittal requirements, and we just didn't mess with that. But I'm comfortable relocating it. Strong feelings one way or the other. The room is pretty neutral, Jen.
Okay. All right.
Keep it where it is.
Keep it where it is, I guess, maybe, as what our chair this evening is saying.
Okay, so keep it.
Yeah, because I'm real sure that's where it is now, and that's why we just carried it over like that.
Yep. That is where it is now. Correct. I'm gonna go to 24, 25, and 26, and then come back to 23 for a second here. 24 is the submittal requirement of showing the location and width of proposed rights of way. The suggestion is to add streets in front of that, so say street rights of way. And then in 25 and 26, where we talk about proposed layout of residential and non-residential areas, to add the word location. So layout and location of residential development and layout and location of non-residential areas. So any disagreement with those? They're pretty simple additions, I think. Okay.
Right of ways.
You could potentially have like a trail right away, depending upon how something's set up.
Yeah, strikes me we should leave it general.
Okay. So no adding streets. Okay. But location and layout sounds okay to everybody?
It appears that way, yeah.
Kind of, okay. That leads us to item 23, which is one of the supplementary material requirements, and this is in your current code, is public cost versus benefit analysis. And Don Hoying had a good suggestion in here, just some kind of question and clarification. Can we clarify what constitutes public cost? Is it just dollars, just direct costs? Same for benefits, not expecting an all-inclusive list, but some sort of example or guidance would help. So I don't know if anyone has any suggested language to add to this, but I do think it does kind of leave that door open to what exactly is expected. Have there been any good examples from the past that anyone can think of that might help us
Now,
clarify this language?
Economic impact study, public cost would be infrastructure that the city would have to provide. And or other entities. I don't know if all the street lights and widening of roads and left turn lanes is necessarily the city's cost. It could be state and other agencies, but
Could be a shared cost too. Could be a shared cost.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was also concerned about the possible bring me a rock, situation where they provide something, we say, well, this doesn't scratch the itch, and they're like, where does it itch, Well, how do I know when I've satisfied that requirement?
Well,
So,
and for context, I pulled up our existing rules because there's this whole other set of information that says, in addition to the above list, the planned business development proposal shall include the following. Our current rules make this distinction between a PUD and a planned business development. Not that a planned business development is ever defined. It's you can imply what that means based on the criteria and stuff that they're talking about. So as part of a planned business development, that's where it talks about a traffic impact study. That's actually not a spelled out requirement for a regular PUD. So when we were looking at this, it's like, okay, a lot of these things really apply to a PUD in general, just as it would for like a rezoning in general. And this is where you see that public cost / benefit analysis was really related to the planned business development proposals.
so is it, if you go to that section, is it defined any more clearly, or is this, or maybe?
No,
this
that's
is-
all it says.
Oh,
Item G, public cost / benefit analysis.
I was looking through the definitions. I didn't see anything that said that.
Yeah, no, it, like I said, that's one of the many questions we have, because the item before that actually talks about estimated employment projections.
But I mean,
So-
that's employment, for example, pretty well defined. Costs and benefits.
Public
so
cost
much.
benefit.
public,
Yes.
So,
The project that comes to mind is we had a very extensive discussion when the Karis project was coming in with their PUD. And we were very much aware of that the property taxes would not be applicable to religious institutions and uses like that, and there would be a direct impact on the provision of services and the cost that would be provided. So that's why it still probably needs to be still there.
Well, and that's why it's under.
well, I definitely want it. I just want it more clearly defined.
Yeah.
Well, the thought that's going through my head is that maybe an economic term, we can look to see if there's some other way to clarify or spell that out, or what does that mean? We can take a look at that. And then,
Anything in your cool book?
that book, no,
Oh.
maybe a different book in my office, but not that one.
We're not the first people to want a cost and benefit analysis. So someone has defined it somewhere.
Yeah, no, and like I said, we just need to do a little digging for where that is.
So that'd be my recommendation, to see if there is a suitable definition provided elsewhere.
Yeah, and to that end, Jen, I think we should add back in estimated employment projections under supplemental materials. Because it's supplemental, it may not be applicable to everything, but depending upon what's coming, what the PUD consists of, it may be appropriate for somebody to provide that information.
Perfect. We can do that. Okay. Anything else on that one? I think that was a good discussion, just finding a good definition of this. All right. Number 27. we're getting into the review criteria for a PUD basically. And let's see. One of the thoughts that was brought forward was the language that we've been kind of working on over the last few meetings about how the project is consistent with the intent of the comprehensive plan. I have a question about this one, and this again might just be my brain kind of thinking too deep into this, but since we do have a rezone application that's coming through with the general development plan, the rezone also would have that same criteria. Do we want it in both places? And I think it's fine to have it in both places, but I do think that's why we didn't put it here, was thinking, well, the PUD rezone would have that consistency language. Do we also need it here for the general plan or general development plan?
And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that. So pragmatically, when we've got this type of an application that comes in front of us and staff is reviewing them and making findings, there's the actual, hey, I want to rezone this to PUD. There's that review criteria, which was the last page of this particular document that we pulled out, since that was in an earlier section. I think it was the last time we met where we talked about zone changes. So there's all that criteria that gets looked at as part of the zone change itself. In this case, it's going to be to a district designated as PUD. And then there's this set of criteria here specific to the general development plan that we're looking at this criteria. So yeah, does it need to be in both places? Potentially. But that's what we're doing in that report, is you've got that list of things that go with the actual zone designation change, and then the list of findings related to the development plan, the general development plan.
I asked that to be inserted because when you go back to the comp plan and it talks about that particular issue, performancy, and it talks about it, I took the language right directly from the comp plan, where a proposed project is consistent with the intent. And I think that kind of addressed some of the things we were talking about at our last meeting. And I believe it's a very strong criteria to include with any development plans that we review.
Thoughts, concerns, difference of opinion? Comfortable with that direction?
I don't have a real objection to it. Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds almost like it's duplicating the effort.
It's
Same end result.
similar, but so based on the room, I'd say add it in, Jen.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Awesome. I think we have just a couple more comments and thoughts here. Again, in that review criteria, there was a suggestion to add two additional criteria. One being the design of the project provides for a unique opportunity for the community and surrounding area. So any thoughts on that one? Kind of going back to that original purpose of a PUD is to create kind of, create or provide for a unique opportunity.
I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with it.
Okay. And then the second criteria that's proposed is may protect or preserve sensitive and significant natural features. And again, this ties pretty directly to the purpose statement.
Yeah, and I think didn't the purpose also mention like historic,
Mm-hmm.
so natural and or historic, something like that.
Okay, we could add that verbiage in there.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. And then Don Hoyne, and this might have already kind of come up, but I think this really did already come up. Your question was, are these directly from the ordinance? If so, recommend citing. Did we address that well enough earlier, or do you want to discuss that any further?
Well, just in general terms,
Mm-hmm.
are we abandoning the word references throughout, or because earlier sections had it and this doesn't, and I find them very, very helpful, very helps clarify where.
Sure.
from.
Oh, where it came from. Okay. Yeah.
This is where we potentially need our city attorney. She might be able to explain this a little bit, but my thought is based on what I see happening, which is essentially because this is restructured so differently. It's not like we're working within the current structure and we're just amending 18.30.030. It's totally being renumbered, that I see the ordinance saying, you know, a complete repeal of the prior one, and that this is the new one. And so in, like where I showed you in on the city website, it would reference like that general list of prior ordinances that were associated with old rules would be my guess. But I'm not the codifier. But that's because it's such a significant change. It's, I don't know that you're gonna see things the way they currently are. You know, with those citations at the end.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Larry, you want to say that a little louder?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, but otherwise it would just. We're trying to really clarify the PUD section. We started adding various citations, it might be very confusing because it might not be directly what was amended.
Well, and even other things that are getting drastically renumbered, you know, when you look back at all the other chapters we've already looked at, I don't know that I see it more as a wholesale repeal and adoption. Which other
Yes.
communities do this
Yeah,
pretty
and-
consistently.
You know, there's no question, you know, that's within the authority and all that.
Mhm.
It does run a possible risk of opening the can of worms where, well, since everything's up for debate and everything's up for discussion, that, you know, it could be hard to close on this when it comes time to review and approve it. Just the more you can anchor it in what was already previously existing code, the more you can stand behind and say, this is just a restructure. When we remove that anchor, just a caution, I'm not against it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong way to do it. But it's just an outcome of that choice.
And I think when you said at the beginning of the meeting, you'll make a notation of existing PUDs. You're reviewed under the previous
This is
rules.
but this is for the whole code, so.
Yep.
More than just PUDs.
No, and I totally understand your concern. And based on what we went through with the short-term rental ordinance, on several occasions, that doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy about anything we do here, quite honestly. But we're tasked with, you know, let's review this, let's clean this up, let's restructure it so it's more functional. So all I can do is what I'm asked.
Well, that was the charge of the comprehensive plan 5 years ago when it was passed, was to do this revision.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
Yeah.
previous versions will still be, as you might say, in the archives to go back to see what the original intents were.
And we have done that on
Apparently-
occasion.
Apparently they're inaccessible.
Well, you can, it just takes work to get to them. But there have been a
Sorry.
couple of occasions where we did that. If you think back to the conversation we were having about our various park fees and when those happen, because there were some that are collected as part of building permits, there's some that are collected at final plat. And that particular set of language was very intertwined and less than clear. And even when you went back to the original ordinance that established that, it wasn't that great then. So trying to unwind that and clarify that. So we've done that research when it's been really, really confusing.
Well,
So,
it's just, we had this discussion a couple meetings ago where we talked about when this goes into the review and public comment and you know, ultimately a final decision for approval or not. We talked about, you know, setting some clarity of ground rules and if this was simply a restructure, you know, we're just moving the parts around, not changing anything. And then we can use that as a ground rule to say, your public comment is interesting, but it's outside the bounds of what we're doing here. You know, if you feel strongly about that, you know, bring it back, request an amendment, et cetera. Now, if we're kind of walking that back, then that opens up the whole spectrum of debate that is applicable. And I'm just offering a word of caution. Like I said, there's no wrong choice, but each choice comes with its pros and cons and its consequences and repercussions. So I'm just cautioning that the more we're open to broad changes, then the more we're open to broad review and broad critique.
and the broad changes are this chapter. And if everybody decides that we really like having to look in literally 52 places to sort out process, council may endorse that ultimately, because that's kind of our
Well, no,
option. Is
that's
right
not-
now, it's literally like,
No one I would say no one disagrees with restructuring. It's recontenting that I'm cautioning on. I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying it's,
okay, I understand. I hear you. I've had those same concerns.
yeah,
This is the path I've been told to do.
okay.
So this is where we're going.
I think the key here is when we present a copy for review, if we can highlight substantive changes in
Jen and I have talked
versus
about that.
carryover of existing language, that would simplify things tremendously in the review process, especially for city council who hadn't been in all these
Yeah.
meetings.
Yeah.
They're gonna need that.
Yeah, no, we've talked about
So,
that. We're aware.
We
of
just
it.
have to show the breadcrumbs and the trail of how we went from
Mhm.
Not gonna watch 20 hours of planning
planning
commission.
commission. We're gonna binge watch it.
And don't make me explain 20 hours.
I think you're underestimating the amount of hours, but yes, just
Yeah.
kidding. Yeah, and I was just combing through that whole conversation. I was combing through your existing PUD, and unless it's somewhere else in one of these 52 locations, your current PUD standards don't actually have any review criteria.
They kind of did, but it's called something weird, Jen. It's,
Okay,
hang on. Requirements for approval. 18.30.030. That's the closest thing we
030.
that even remotely resembles review criteria.
Right, okay, yes, and that's some of the stuff that we've rolled into other sections of this section. And did roll a couple of these into criteria. Okay, thank you for that, Karen. I was staring at this and staring at this going, where are the criteria? So, I think that pretty much gets through our
Pardon.
comments. There was, oh,
Dragon.
go ahead.
This list.
Yeah.
If it didn't come from 18.30.030. Where did A through F come from?
We
Um,
probably pulled some of that from the model code. We also likely pulled that from exactly what you guys were pointing at, the purpose statement. Is this meeting the intent of a PUD?
Yeah, you're right, Karen. Most of it came from the intent and those requirements of approval reworded to be a review criteria rather than kind of a purpose and intent.
Because right now, the review requirements for approval. Let me just pull it up. Oh,
And
actually,
I have it up too, actually, Karen, here, want me to bring it over here?
screen, but that, yeah, that 030.
Oops.
So it's literally that one or more of the following conditions exist. And yeah, literally, based on the way that says, one or more, you really only need to meet one of those to have your PUD approved. I don't know that they can you make that larger, Jen?
Well,
I,
he says
Yeah.
let me see.
one or more of the above plus the following.
For a planned business development, so that's only if
Ah.
you're dealing with business.
There, I think I got it a little larger.
So that's where this came from, is, like I said, we were working off of other established resources.
And that's scattered out through our code, different language for
Yeah.
review criteria. Now we're being consistent.
Working at it.
Sounds like most probably fall under A. Is that a fair statement?
Well, and these are criteria for the general development plan. So yeah, it's that document, that part of the PUD. That's what this section of criteria is for at the end that we were just talking about prior to going to this screen of the current rules.
Because this new list doesn't much resemble the prior one.
Again, we've got two parts. There's the actual zone change. So you've got all of those criteria on page 5 of what you were reviewing. With the addition, and that's actually, I think, where some of these from this list in the current section appear. It is actually. So for on your screen to the left, Jen, the window,
Yeah.
can you pull up the last page of in Conveo and scroll down to the bottom where it says
Oh, yes,
you
yes.
for PUD. So those that are now numbered A and then, or actually it's B1 through B1 through 3. That's where you see probably a closer correlation
Yeah.
to what's in that requirements for approval section.
Okay, I found where some of the criteria are that we have up on the previous page. It was in the final plan requirements approval, the development plan. So this A here, 1830.080A, talks about a development plan of the PUD district shall meet the requirements of accepted land planning practices. And then it has a list of promote public health, safety, and general welfare, provide adequate light, air, privacy, and convenience, lessen and avoid congestion of the public streets and highways, conserve the values of surrounding properties, and protect against fire, panic, explosion, noxious fumes, flooding along natural watercourses and other hazards. So that's where some of those criteria came from as well.
This criteria that we're looking at is to the point, very clear, very concise.
So it really does attempt to correlate 1-to-1. So the requirements for approval of a PUD zone, that shows up under that zone district review criteria. there's an added section specific to PUDs. So when you're talking about the PUD generally, that's where that landed, was for rezoning to a PUD. The section of our current rules that talk about final plan requirements, that criteria is what's showing up as part of our general development plan. So there, we really did logically try to link them. And like I said, there's a little bit of what we cleaned up in terms of language, so it's worded a little better, so it's a little easier to make a finding to when you're writing that staff report. But really, we did try to remain true to what we've got. It's just because it's such a restructuring, it is hard to remember what you touched and where you touched and how it aligns. So I apologize, it took us a little bit to be able to explain that.
Well, I withdraw my earlier comment about adding historic, preserving historic character, because that's covered under the zone approval criteria. So it doesn't need to be under the plan approval criteria.
That's true. It is here.
Oh.
Okay. That sounds good. And then Don, did that answer your question? I think you had a question here about and or criteria.
Yeah, were those all the above or just some or just wasn't clear?
Where is that? bubble?
Okay. It is this 31 here. We don't have an and or an or. We just say the following criteria shall apply to a general development plan. And I think what Don's question is it all of the above or is it one? And I think I interpret it as all of the above. It needs to meet all of these criteria.
Yeah, I was viewing
Yeah.
it as all of them that you're making findings to when writing the report.
Yeah, if our chairman was here tonight, Lee would tell us all about the ors of and or.
Well, the worst is not clarifying and then.
Like in our conditional use permit section, Jen, we've got a list of criteria like that. So we may want to check
Mm-hmm.
language we have there when making findings to a list, since we've already hoed that road.
Let me ask
Yep.
this question just as a point of clarification. These are the criteria that are used in the review process for this general development plan. It doesn't tell us what the results need to be based on our findings in this review in particular. But if we said we're going to check every one of these items and we find that it does nothing for protecting against fire, panic, explosion, or noxious fumes, that's really not applicable. And then some of these others, it does some good and others maybe a little less. Then we decide after we've reviewed all these criteria, whether this is an appropriate PUD for Woodland Park, correct?
Yeah.
There's not like you got to have 51% positive results out of 25 criteria.
Yeah,
And
the
it's-
code isn't set up with a numerical findings like that,
Exactly.
or a weighted rank.
It's just, this is the criteria that we consider when reviewing a general development plan. Then we make a decision whether we push it to the city council and let them chew on it and decide if they think it's worth approving or not. We suggest it's for approval, so it goes to them, or we say we don't approve it because of these reasons. And it still goes to council and they can still do it. They deem best in the interest of the city.
Oh,
They're
we
almost like anti-negative criteria, like, it says promotes public health. I think we're really saying is can't degrade public health.
Well, and when you're writing a report, it's very difficult to make a finding to a negative criteria. It's a brain damaging exercise to write that. When I first got out of graduate school and worked for Mesa County, which is Grand Junction on the West Slope, their code at that time was written that way. And you just drove yourself crazy in terms of and our staff reports always sounded incredibly negative, and the developers hated that because you were beating their project up. And it was like, well, no, it's like what we're stuck with. And they did a wholesale rewrite of the code, much more user-friendly, went more towards, because this was definitely a big issue 20 years ago, more towards layperson's language as opposed to plannerese or legalese. And then and just really reworded things. So it was much easier to write a finding, be more positive, or at least not negative about something.
Won't basically any development fail C? Well, any development adds some degree of congestion to the public streets and highways? I mean,
That's a current criteria. I'm real sure it's current, Jen, on that other list.
It is. Yeah.
So kind of like our suggestion on the other list to strike the word urban, does this potentially need to be revised?
it's more like mitigates. I mean, Walmart clearly added congestion in a whole new big intersection, you know, but they mitigated it with the light and the turn lanes and, you know, so we said on balance, it's good. So just maybe the wording in C isn't quite what we're trying to say.
I would agree with mitigate. I think that's a good change.
Nobody's arguing that point, so probably does need to be revised.
Okay. All right.
Are we done with the comments on the screen?
I believe so, unless anyone else has anything else.
I have one more comment. I forgot to put that down. That was one of my general comments at the beginning. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't put it on there, but are these plans going to be perpetual? Or are they going to have an expiration date like a site plan and?
I would think it's perpetual because these are the additional parameters associated with that PUD.
Uh-huh,
They should not have an expiration date.
okay,
Because then you end up with a zone district with nothing in it, and that's not helpful to anybody. You gotta know, what am I working with? What uses can I put in here? What are my setbacks? Where can things be located? And I said, if somebody comes along, if it does not develop, it sits there for 10 years and somebody else comes along and says, hey, the world has changed. We need to revise this. Then they're going back through and submitting an amended plan or updating that plan. So that goes through that whole public hearing process again. So the zone district, that PUD would continue to stand, and then they're just updating the plan associated with that.
mhm. We have a regular customer that comes in with a request for extension of the PUD.
We got a couple regulars.
Oh,
On-
I'm glad you had the right answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
I agree.
I mean, yeah, at a planner level, I mean, you know, that's one of those things that's like, who's benefiting from that? You know, who's really winning by that perpetual review when nothing's changed it? And this is what we decided is appropriate in this district at this location.
So Larry, may I make a couple comments?
Sure.
So I went back in my notes and looked up this conversation of purpose and intent. And it started out as purpose. When you did the first draft, you changed it to intent and purpose. Then it was discussed to change it to purpose and intent. So that's what I got. You can do whatever you want with it. I don't care, but that way you don't have to go look it up.
We appreciate you doing the research. I can tell you that for sure.
Be intent.
We should change it at least 2 more times before we send it.
Somebody have reputation to this.
Then I consistently get questions as to why is this process taking so long? Pick a team, people.
And then my other comment, Larry, is I don't disagree with the water feasibility study and availability, but I don't know how they can really get that information without, I mean, they got to do a pretty in-depth. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a problem leaving it in there. I'm just trying to figure out the ease of trying to make this not difficult. If
that makes any sense.
But let's do that.
What's that?
Let's keep it in there, but I'll make it difficult.
Make it different. Okay, all right. I mean, I'm just sitting on the UAC right now, so it's not simple to figure out. That's all I'm saying. And that's all I had.
Any other comments, concerns about this tonight? Like I said, we've got a couple more sections that we know we need to add to this. Specifically addressing how plan amendments happen and then those transition provisions for things that have previously been approved. Just to provide some guidance. So, at some point you're not sitting there with the guy going, hey, I got this plan. It's been sitting here. I think it's expired. What do I do? So.
If not, then we're done with our work session for tonight.
Unless somebody has something else.
Okay, let's close the work session and go back to our agenda. And Karen, do you have any reports for us?
I do. I just want to note about some upcoming meetings. This end of this month, February 27th, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We do have a work session, but you've got two different draft ordinances that you're being asked to take a look at. The first one relates to what's commonly called cyclodyn therapy or natural medicine healing centers and businesses.
Mushrooms.
Yes,
Yeah.
so
Simple.
Betsy Stewart with our city attorney's office, she's been working on that, preparing something at council's direction. There was a work session that was done with council not that long ago. So in your packet, I'll reference what meeting that was. You're welcome to and encouraged to go back and watch that hour-long work session to get some of that background information around a lot of that. And so that's the first ordinance for your review, and it is a work session. So from that work session, that's where we're making any potential suggested revisions to that ordinance that will be at a public hearing in front of you on March 13th.
Is Betsy gonna be,
Betsy is planned to be here in person on the 27th, because I know you guys haven't seen or interacted with her very much. And I know she'd like to really get to know you guys a little bit, and I thought that would be advantageous. So assuming there's no giant snowstorms that really screw things up, that is the plan with that. So the second ordinance you're gonna have that evening, and it kind of caught me by surprise a little bit, is one coming out of the Utility Advisory Committee at the direction of City Council. And that is to firm up within this Title 18, our zoning regulations, that requirement that there is available water to support whatever use is potentially going in. So there's a little bit of that happens in Title 17, some of it in Title 18. And so Jen, we very may get language out of that particular ordinance that we can then plug in here, specific to PUDs and a couple other places.
Yes.
So, like I said, that will be a work session also on the 27th. Attempting to schedule that for public hearing also on March 13th. March 13th is going to be a very robust night. Might have to delay something because there's also two other development cases. One is a very straightforward preliminary plat extension. And then the other one is a more complicated final plat that may or may not actually happen that night. The goal is to have that happen. So we don't circle back to this project again until the second meeting in March, which I think is also the 27th. So working your fingers to the bone here.
I hesitate to ask the question, but here goes anyway. So relative to the first draft ordinance on the wellness centers, is that the term?
Healing centers.
Healing center.
Mhm.
Strikes me that that might bring up some similar debate as what's probably occurred when the marijuana laws were passed in the state of Colorado, and the city had to decide whether or not to permit that within its boundaries. So might some historical information from that discussion be relevant to this one?
I don't know that it is. And the reason is it's a little bit different thing from the standpoint of The healing centers or those businesses, that's all done under a licensed therapist, if I remember correctly. And Councilmember Nakai might be able to.
Yeah, so the healing centers are actually a right, a given right to do it. What we are allowed to do is limit distance to
Oh, time, place,
facilities.
and manner is
Right
basically
place,
what
yeah, time,
we
place, and manner.
regulate.
Okay.
Marijuana, we could actually say yes or no.
Hmm.
We didn't have to allow recreation. We didn't have to
Okay.
allow. So it's a little different.
So it's
We-
not a yes or no.
It's not a
just
yes or
when
no,
now.
it's where we want them and how we want them.
Okay.
So it's a little different. that
Okay.
way.
Okay, thank you.
And regulated differently, differently. And it's just, it's not as Wild West feeling as like when, medical marijuana first hit the scene back in like 2012-ish, I want to say it was. So, anyhow, I think by watching that work session and then, the packet materials and then, Betsy leading us through that work session, you'll get most of your questions answered, and your suggestions and recommendations are always appreciated, which is why we go through this. So,
Yep, thanks.
so that's what I had for you all. It's just kind of an update about your schedule.
Does anybody else have anything to report? Hearing none?
Just thank you all very much for your time and dedication. Really appreciate the conversation, the discussion, the concerns. It does help us get to a much better product. It's taken us a while, but I'm hopeful for a solid product after all of this. So thank you.
It's 8:16 and we're adjourned.